For this class, what we did was we designed a method that focused a lot on case studies and narrative research. And this was because of the time and the time constraints that we have for an accelerated summer class. With that said, I want to talk a little bit about ethnography, action research, and phenomenology, as these are really major elements of research within education. And if we're talking about qualitative research in education settings, we should talk a little bit about these and how they look within the context of the education setting. Um, First, what I want to do though is I want to talk just quickly about social science papers and what a full paper would look like if you were taking this in a regular full quarter with me. As you perhaps embark on your own qualitative research journey, and if you were to engage in further research. So one of the things you're going to notice in a lot of the readings that I've posted and peer-reviewed um, studies is that they align a lot with that scientific method that we explored several weeks ago. The first is that you identify a problem where you ask a question, right? And this overlaps with a social science paper because that's where you have your introduction, and in that introduction is your problem statement and your research question. Then you have your develop a hypothesis. Now, in qualitative, we are not developing hypotheses, correct? But we are looking at previous research to inform the trajectory of our research. We use our literature review. You do develop a hypothesis in quantitative, but you're also using literature. And nonetheless, the literature, previous studies, and research are helping guide the study, guide the directing, and helps us understand what already exists out there and what do we need to do from here on out. Then you collect your data, and that is the methodology section of a paper. And you'll see that there's a lot of overlap, a big alignment between our step 3 of the scientific method and the methodology. You've collected your data, and in the methodology is the process where you explain in detail how you collected that data. Then you analyze your data, and that's your findings section, right? That's where you've taken your data, you analyze it, and you have now these analytical ideas and themes laid out. Then you evaluate it and you readjust accordingly. And this is where you talk about in your discussion, how does it meet, if it was quantitative, the hypothesis, or if it's qualitative, how does it address the research questions? What did it do in terms of the previous literature? How does it connect? And what are some things that you would need to change or some obstacles that you face? So to be able to navigate a social science paper, that's what you would do. And that would be a very similar process for you as you were to write one if you were to write one. You have a very brief introduction. The introduction generally is something that's a little more detailed and in depth. You do have a problem statement. You provide deeper context. You have the research questions, and you introduce folks to that, and it acts as a roadmap. Then you have a detailed literature review. You did annotated bibliographies, which would be used for your literature review, but it would be in deeper detail. And then you have your methodology, your findings, and your discussion. I'm asking them for more of a abbreviated version, right? So that way it doesn't have as much detail, but you're just kind of weaving things together to see how they piece together with this one interview. So now that we've done that, let's talk a little bit about action research and how this takes place in the field of education. Action research is incredibly useful for education, and it is something that is taught in a lot of teacher education programs around the world. The United States is a little behind on that, and it's not something that's deeply embedded within teacher education quite as frequently. There is some push. There are obviously some exceptions to that. But the heart of it is action, right? You're conducting research to engage in some sort of action, the idea of change. There are a lot of different schools of thought around action research. So there's some that talk about the different cycles of research. There's some around, different philosophical underpinnings. So you have participatory action research, you have critical action research, you have action research, participant action research. Which is participatory. There's a lot of different types of research that exist, but really at the heart is action research. We can have a whole lecture on the different lecture on the different types of action research that exist out there. But at the core of it within education is that the focus is on teaching and learning. A lot of it is on your own practice as a teacher within the classroom, but you can also look at it in terms of institutional practice as well. I used youth participatory action research for my dissertation, which was involving youth in the outcomes and deliverables, the action part of the research. they conducted research with me, they collaborated, they analyzed the research, and we created some deliverables together. I did an action research piece that resulted in curriculum development for a high school that I was working at. So there's a lot of different ways. Right, that was an institutional practice, but you'll see that a lot of action research is used for personal, individual, your own practice as well. The idea that it's something within control, right, something that can actually be changed. Of course, institutional practices, that may not be the case. If you are, single-handedly doing it, the curriculum that I developed ended up having to be approved um, by the administrators. It was a big kind of pain in the big picture, but nonetheless, it was still something that was within control, and I had a conversation with them. Another element is that it should be goal and passion oriented, right? You don't want to be doing this on math if you're an English teacher and that's not your jam. Like, you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that is helping you meet a goal and helping align with your interests and passions. Also, at the heart of it is not just to understand phenomena, not to just understand processes. Um, but it should be, the goal should be for it to be something should be able to be improved or changed. That's kind of the heart of what this is. And we really are asking the question, like, what is the purpose of research? Is it to just understand something, which it can be? Is it to critically understand something? Is it to criticize structures, or is it to understand and change? And for action research specifically, it's to understand what's happening and to change it. Um, so what do you do in action research? So one element is you ask the questions, right? You start asking questions about the institution or your classroom, like what's working, what's not working, what's happening, what do I want to see changed, what is something that could really do better, what's something that is working really well, what are students interested in, what are they not interested in. A lot of it requires just kind of throwing ideas out there, and you do keep a lot of memos in action research because you want to make sure that you are documenting every step, every element of this. There are pilot studies sometimes involved with it, which is you have a study and you do it for a smaller scale group of folks. And then with that, you implement it in a larger scale. So my dissertation was the result of several pilot studies that culminated into a larger study. In a lot of action research, especially some schools of thought, the idea is cycles of research. So for me, I like to call them pilot studies because they may not be a cycle of research. But for some folks, they like to look at it in terms of cycles of research, where your first cycle is developing and identifying a problem of practice. Your second cycle might be designing the research. The third cycle might be implementing a pilot of that program. The fourth cycle might be an evaluation of it, right? So there's different cycles of research. Depends on, what your kind of idea is. Cycles of research may be relevant to some things. I tend to gravitate more toward pilot studies, but nonetheless, it may be relevant. So some examples of research questions or kind of just ideas that would really benefit from action research would be, what methods are best used to engage my fifth grade students? So if you're an elementary school student, right, and you realize that maybe engagement is really low, you're like, what methods really are using? So you would engage it, you would have that research question, and you would start collecting data. So you would try to pilot or run different types of methods in the classroom to engage them. And then you would make notes. You would do observations. You would take notes, maybe even ask students and focus groups on, what's working. What do they really like about this? What is it? I see that you're not, engaging really with your peer. What's going on? So that could be one thing. Another could be, how can I better support literacy interventions in a ninth grade course? So maybe students are a little, struggling with certain elements of reading in ninth grade. So then you're going to implement different literacy programs or interventions in that ninth grade course. So these are some things, because we're in we're all sitting in higher education class. One might be, how does the institution support students who will be first generation in college? Now, that can be phenomenological, that can be ethnographic. There's a lot of elements, but that could benefit from action research too, because you're going to find out maybe what the problem of practice is with supporting students who are first generation in college, and then go from there, right? So there's a lot of elements that are infused within action research, and a lot of different types of questions that would really benefit from action research. If you are looking to get into the field of education, I do highly suggest that you look more into action research, or you can, chat with me as well, and I can kind of give you some tips on that too. But I think action research is something that is often dismissed in education, but really so thoroughly needed. Some considerations for action research would be other research designs that might be useful within it. So action research, action is the heart of it. So one might be survey design. So you might want to create a survey, right, which will have quantitative and qualitative in there. So you might want to do something that will help figure out, literacy rates to begin with. You may have some ethnographic approaches. You'll use focus groups, you'll use interviews, you'll do content analysis. If you're doing participatory action research, you'll include the participants, which means that they help you with the research design. They will absolutely help you with the data collection. They'll help analyze it. And I bring this up because critical action research is kind of an area that I'm at. I do a lot of what's called visual participatory action research. And it's really infusing photographs, well, for me, photographs, but visuals with the participatory aspect of research. And the reason I do that is my philosophical underpinning. So Paulo Freire, who wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, says these two quotes here. And this is one of the things that is really important to me. So the first is, the truth is, however, that the oppressed are not marginals, are not people living outside society. They have always been inside the structure, which made them beings for others. So and I really bring this whole quote up. So go ahead and read the whole quote. But I bring this quote up because within research and in higher ed, like equity work, we talk a lot about people who are marginalized, right? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong necessarily with using that phrasing, because I get it. But what Paulo Freire is saying here, though, is that the idea is that people who are oppressed are not in the margins, right? So think about the margins of paper. They're not marginal, right? They're not in the marginals. They've always been a part of society. They've always been there. The structure has made them other beings for others and have dehumanized them though. So the idea is not to just simply make them a part of the structure because they've always been a part of that, but to create a world, right, that is anti-oppression and liberatory. The next one is relevant to research specifically. And he says, just as the educator may not elaborate a program to present to the people, neither may the investigator elaborate itineraries for researching the thematic universe, starting from points which he has predetermined. Both education and the investigation designed to support it must be sympathetic activities in the etymological sense of the word. That is, they must consist of communication and of the common experience of a reality perceived in the complexity of its constant becoming. So first off, note, right, Paulo Freire's time when he's writing this, that's why he uses he as the default. But this is for anybody, he, she, they, and any other pronoun that you might identify with. And in this case, Paulo Freire is talking about the fact that the researcher oftentimes is not exploring these elements with people, right? The researcher has predetermined this aspect, though, predetermined what the outcome is. And in this case, what happens, though, is that it has to instead really be communicative. It has to recognize that people are not, singular, they don't have a singular experience and that they aren't stuck or in a concrete space. There's this constant state of becoming. So I really want to think about that when you're thinking about research, right? Consider these elements when you're thinking about the role of action research, and that even if there's a problem of practice identified in action research or participatory action research, and also note, participatory action research does not always rely on a problem of practice. Let me make that very clear. Action research in the nature of education does. Okay, so we're going to move on now to phenomenology. So phenomenology is another research design that that a lot of you would probably have ended up choosing if you had a longer class to take this in. Phenomenology is both a philosophy and a methodology because it's the study of consciousness, right? How are we aware of things? How do we become aware of things? So in this case, we're studying a specific phenomenon. Week one, I explored this in more detail. Smith says it's a study of structure surrounding individual experiences through a first-person lens. So obviously you can't adopt the lens of a person, but you are taking their experiences There's a lot of different types of phenomenology out there, though, as well. There's the human noetical phenomenology, which is the interpretations of structures of lived experiences. Phenomenology can also be a class in and of itself. I'm not going to get into all of the different types. There's like 7 to 10 different types that would require a ton of detail. Hermeneutics is probably one of the more common approaches of phenomenology, though, that exist. So how do you conduct phenomenology? You do interviews, you do observations only if it's relevant. So let's say you're thinking about how teachers are navigating the new ethnic studies requirement. Then maybe you would do observations of ethnic studies teachers, right? The phenomenon in that case being the teaching of ethnic studies. Also, the code word for right now for this lecture is license. So that's the first code word is license. Okay, so interviews are crucial for phenomenology. That is the default is interviews. Observations, like I said, would only be relevant if it's within the phenomenon. Um, and depending on the type of phenomenology will also help determine what the approach would be. So perhaps you are using photographs for them to analyze, right? That would be the structure of an interpretation. But the idea is you're looking at, their lived experiences and how to explain a social phenomenon through their lived experiences. And then lastly, we have ethnography. Please note that these three are not the only three that exist out there. There's tons of different types of research designs, but these are three that I think are really important for the state of education. So ethnography is the art and science of describing a group or culture. The description may be of a small tribal group in an exotic land or a classroom in middle class urban. I use this quote, this is by Fetterman in 1998, because the idea of exoticizing people is, problematic. Um, what he is trying to say here, though, what Fetterman is trying to say is that the idea of culture, though, and these descriptions can be across any group. We do tend to minimize culture to ethnicity oftentimes or race, but that's not what it is. Culture can change. Culture can be generational, right? If you think about the cultural values of San Diego versus Peoria, Illinois, right? Cultural values will be different between those two groups. Culture between somebody who is South Korean growing up in Los Angeles versus living in South Korea, right? So there's different experiences that folks may have. Culture can be very different, and that's what Fetterman is trying to get at. Ethnography does have roots in anthropology and has been used very dehumanizingly. So we're not going to pretend it isn't, the case, but there has been a huge shift for critical ethnography to be more humanizing and to be aware of this problematic history. Observations around details, cultural norms, and values, and the transmission of knowledge and of said values is crucial for ethnography. Sometimes you could do interviews as well because you're looking for perspectives and thought processes, values, beliefs, and their environments. And also content analysis and documents. And you're going to want to look at also cultural artifacts, right? So you could sometimes take photographs. You can document what's said in their documents. Look at photographs and visuals. And so there's a lot of elements around this that are ethnographic in nature. Now, which approach do you use? So the first is that it really depends on your research question. Your research question is really always going to help determine what your approach is. It helps determine your methodological approach very much so. Your philosophy, though, your research questions will often align with your philosophy because your philosophy is helping you understand what's going on in the world, right? You want to know what's going on in the world, and what you want to know is dependent upon what your philosophy is. So oftentimes your philosophy helps influence your research question, which in turn then would influence, what your approach is to understand the world. So I just kind of wanted to touch upon that a little bit more and help you kind of understand these. I will give you one last code word, and that last code word is movie. So the last code word is movie. If you were in a longer class, then you would actually be choosing one of these approaches to engage in, but I want you to at least have an understanding of what the concepts are.